So hello everyone and welcome back to yet another video on income tax. And today we are going to discuss about the new TDS provision under 194Q which will be effective from 1st July 2021 onwards. And this new TDS provision is as a part of February 2021 annual budget. And this is for buyers whom are actually purchasing any type of goods above a threshold are required to deduct this tax. So without wasting time friends, let's get into more details. So as I told you, this new TDS provision will be effective from 1st July 2021. Alright, so students whom are actually pursuing their CA, CMA, final as well as inter for May 2022 onwards have to follow this new TDS provision under 194Q. Alright, so moving forward friends, let's understand who is the deductor. So deductor means the person who is required to deduct tax while making the payment. Alright, so the deductor is buyer. While purchasing any goods when he is responsible for making any sum to a resident seller. That simply means if you are a buyer and you are purchasing goods from a seller and that seller have to be a resident. Alright, if it is so, then this buyer while making the payment to the seller is required to deduct tax under 194Q, and that's what we are discussing. So moving forward, buyer shall not include a person where central government may specifically notify. That simply means central government have the power to notify certain category of buyers. If they do so, then that category of buyers will be excluded from the ambit of this 194Q. That simply means all those central government notified buyers are not required to deduct tax under 194Q. Again, moving forward friends, conditions for tax deduction. So now let's understand which all are the conditions under 194Q while deducting TDS. Stating with the first one, the aggregate value of good purchased in the year should be more than rupees 50 lakhs. And condition number 2, the turnover of the buyer in preceding financial year should be more than 10 crore. So friends, let's understand this by way of an example. Say I am Mr. Buyer and my turnover in the financial year say 2020-21 is 15 crore. Alright, and in 2021-22 I am purchasing goods worth 70 lakhs from Mr. Seller. Alright, so from Mr. Seller. So Mr. Seller is another person who sells the goods. Alright, so I am Mr. Buyer. While making the payment, Mr. B is supposed to deduct TDS. Alright, on which value? On the value which is exceeding 50 lakhs. That means this year I have purchased goods of worth 70 lakh. Yes or no? So TDS is required to be deducted on the value which exceeds 50 lakh. That simply means on that 20 lakh. And where this 20 lakh came from, the total value of goods purchased is 70. Over and above 50 is only subjected to TDS under 194Q. Alright, so the 20 lakhs, on the 20 lakhs buyer is supposed to deduct TDS. And after deducting TDS, buyer is supposed to pay to the credit of central government. So that's what 194Q states about. And the pivotal point is the buyer is required to deduct TDS under 194Q only if in the preceding financial year his turnover exceeds 10 crore. That means if the buyer's turnover in 2021 exceeds 10 crore, then only while making payment in 21-22 for the goods which is purchased over and above 50 lakh, he is supposed to deduct TDS. I hope that point is clear. So moving forward with the next one is another important thing, that is rate. What is the rate of TDS to be deducted? That is, rate is on 0.1% to be deducted on the value exceeding 50 lakhs. That simply means in our previous example, the total value of goods we have purchased was 70. Alright, and the buyer's turnover in the preceding financial year is more than 10 crore as well. So TDS is required to be deducted on 0.1 percentage. That means on that 20 lakh, buyer is supposed to deduct TDS at 0.1 percentage. That's what the act says. So TDS is required to be deducted at 0.1 percentage over and above 50 lakh. So this 50 acts as a threshold. Again, moving forward, there is another point that you have to consider. If the seller makes any default in furnishing either PAN or Aadhaar, then the rate will become 5% instead of 0.1%. If the seller defaults in furnishing PAN or his Aadhaar number, then under section 206AA, the rate of TDS will become 5% instead of 0.1%, and that's what it says. So moving forward, what exactly is the time of deduction? That's what we need to know. The time of deduction as per the act is either at the time of making payment or putting credit in the books of accounts of the buyer, whichever happens earlier. Say either the TDS is required to be deducted, either the buyer puts a credit entry in his books of accounts or puts a credit in his books of accounts for that particular purchases he made, or at the time of payment, whichever happens first, that is the moment of TDS deduction. At that moment, buyer have to make sure that he have deducted TDS under 194Q. And again, moving forward, non-applicability of TDS under 194Q. In the following circumstance, 194Q, that means TDS which we are discussing right now, is not applicable. It says the provisions of this section shall not apply to a transaction on which tax is deductible under any of the provisions of the act. That simply means if you are purchasing certain goods and TDS is applicable under any other provisions of Income Tax Act, then you are not supposed to deduct TDS again under 194Q. Hope you got my point. So if TDS is required to be deducted on the same transaction under any other provisions of the act, then you don't need to deduct again under 194Q. And there is one more circumstance. If tax is collectible under 206C other than 206C1H, it says if on the same transaction, if the seller is required to collect TCS, alright, then buyer is not supposed to deduct TDS, and there is an exception. That exception is under section 206C1H. And what is 206C1H? In certain circumstance, when a seller sells goods and its value of goods sold is more than 50 lakh, then the seller is supposed to collect TCS on 0.1 percentage of the value which is more than 50 lakh. That is what 206C1H. So friends, if you are not sure about 206C1H, please click on the I button, because I've done a separate video on explaining what exactly is 206C1H TCS. Alright, now what if on the same transaction both 194Q and 206C1H applies? So let's understand. If the buyer is required to deduct tax under 194Q, and for the same transaction, if the seller too is required to collect tax at source under 206C1H, because 206C1H is also a TCS which is applicable for seller while selling any type of goods, and the value of sales, if it exceeds 50 lakhs, then the seller is required to collect tax. So that is 206C1H. So if you have a literal look at 194Q and 206C1H, it is actually contradicting. Alright, and the point it says, then section 194Q overrides. That means for a single transaction, for the same transaction, if the buyer is required to deduct TDS, as well as for the same transaction if the seller is required to collect TCS, so there is a contradiction. In that instance, then 194Q will override. That simply means the buyer himself is responsible to deduct TDS under 194Q, and the seller is not supposed to collect TCS on the same transaction if it is covered under 194Q. So that's what it says. It is a responsibility of the buyer to deduct tax, and the seller is not supposed to collect tax on the same transaction. Again, let's understand this by way of a simple example. So please listen. Mr. Buyer purchasing goods worth 70 lakhs on 10th December 2021. So Mr. Buyer is a person who buys a product worth of 70 lakhs from Mr. Seller. The turnover of Mr. Buyer for 2020-21 is 15 crore. and turnover of Mr. Seller for 2021 is 22 crore. So this is under section 206C1H. So friends, here for the same transaction, that means the buyer purchased goods of 70. That means the seller sold goods of 70. For that same transaction, both 194Q and 206C1H is applicable. So in that instance, what you require to do? Here, Mr. Buyer is only required to deduct TDS under 194Q at 0.1 percentage on the value exceeding 50 lakhs. That is, on the 20 lakhs, 0.1 percentage is the TDS to be deducted by the buyer, and the rate is, and the amount will become 2000 rupees. And when TDS is required to be deducted, either at the time of payment or credit, whichever comes first. Alright, so let's understand one more example. So example 2. Mr. Buyer purchasing goods of worth 80 lakhs on 15th December 2021 from Mr. Seller. So turnover of Mr. Buyer in this example is only 5 crore and turnover of Mr. Seller in this example is 25 crore. So here the turnover in the preceding financial year for the buyer is only 5 crore and 194Q is not applicable, because hope you remember the condition if 194Q comes into picture should be that buyer's turnover in the preceding financial year should be more than 10 crore. And this, in this instance or in this example, buyer's turnover is not exceeding what? 10 crore, and hence we can say 194Q is not applicable. But this transaction is definitely covered under 206C1H. Why? Because in the current year, that sales was for the value which is more than 50 lakhs. And along with that, under 206C1H, hope you have gone through that particular video. Under 206C1H, if the seller's preceding year's turnover is more than 50 lakh, then the seller is required to collect TCS on that value exceeding 50 lakhs. That's what they are saying. So here Mr. Seller is required to collect tax under 206C1H at what rate? At 0.1 percentage on the value exceeding 50 lakhs. That means here total values of sales was 80 and the value exceeding 50 would be 30 lakhs. On that 30 lakhs, 0.1 percentage, that will become 3000 rupees is the tax to be collected by the seller. Seller, apart from this collecting 80 lakhs, so the sales value is 80. Along with that, he should collect an additional 3000 rupees from the buyer because it is covered under section 206C1H. Hope you got what I said. Again, moving forward, let's discuss some frequently asked questions in relation to 194Q. So the first one, if the buyer importing goods from outside India, is he required to deduct tax at source under 194Q? Suppose the buyer is importing some goods to India. Then if that value of goods imported is more than 50 lakhs and the turnover of buyer in the preceding financial year exceeding 10 crore, then TDS is required to be deducted by the buyer while making the payment. That is the question. The answer is the obligation to deduct tax under this provision arises only when the payment is made to a resident seller. Importing normally means you are purchasing goods from a non-resident seller, right? Because you are purchasing goods from outside India, and if the seller's residential status is non-resident, then 194Q will not come into that picture, because 194Q, the act is very specific that if you are purchasing goods from a seller who is a resident, then only 194Q kicks in. So we can simply conclude that in the case of imports, 194Q will never come in picture, provided that seller's residential status is what? Non-resident. Moving forward, next FAQ is what about goods exported out of India and the buyer is a non-resident? Say the buyer is exporting, all right? Say he's exporting goods from India, and or we can say that, say for example, that buyer is a non-resident. All right, the buyer is a non-resident and the seller is exporting goods out of India. All right, so there is a buyer and he is outside India and he is non-resident. All right, then the residential status of buyer who is making the payment is not relevant under this provision, and hence TDS under 194Q may arise. That simply means what? Say seller in India and buyer in some other country, and the buyer buys goods. All right, then 194Q may kick in subjected to the other provisions of income tax, because residential status of buyer is never a concern. All right, hope you are getting my point. So in this instance, 194Q may arise. And moving forward with the third FAQ, it says that whether TDS is to be deducted on total invoice value including GST. So what happens is when you are purchasing some goods, definitely it will be covered under GST. Now the question is on what value you are supposed to deduct TDS, either on the value which excludes GST or on the value which includes GST. So this is a practical confusion. So CBDT has issued a notification on this issue because till now there is no clarification given by the Central Board of Direct Taxes on this issue. But however, in relation to section 206C1H, the CBDT issued a circular number 17 dated 29 September 2020 and has clarified that tax should be collected on the value including GST. So for the purpose of TCS, under 206C1H, CBDT has issued a notification, all right, on 29 September 2020, and it specifically states that TCS have to be collected on the value which is including GST, all right. And applying the same principle, it can be concluded that TDS also should be deducted on the value including GST because CBDT has not clearly notified anything. So applying the same principle or same rationale, you can say that TDS is also required to be collected on the value including GST. Simple example I'll tell you, say 70 lakhs is my purchase value, all right, and say 2 lakhs is my GST. 2 lakhs is my GST amount. So simply you can say on this 72 lakhs you have to deduct TDS, or the buyer have to deduct TDS. And again, CBDT haven't issued any notification on this issue. So this is, we have applied the same principles of 206C1H. All right. So friends, I hope this session is informative for you. So if you like this video, please don't forget to share it with your friends and colleagues. So friends, that's all for now. Take care and see you with the next update on income tax, and take care and bye-bye.